Okie doke. Good evening, everyone. I hope things are well with you. And yeah, thanks for joining me on this bank holiday Monday. Yeah, so I've got a bunch of things to talk about here. I've got a bunch of things to talk about in relation to the presidential election and the results, and I'm going to go through kind of all the different factions, all the bits and pieces of it, the results, the data, the trends, all of that. As per usual, yeah, I mean, like, sound check and whatnot, or if you want to leave a comment, go for it, all of that. But ultimately, just to be a bit more structured about this, I'm gonna divide this stream up into a number of different components. So basically, I'm gonna talk about what the presidential election kind of is, what I got right, what I got wrong, referencing back my previous stream that I did on this about 3 or 4 weeks ago. Then I'm going to talk about the data, the overall findings. I'm going to talk about a couple of Kevin Cunningham research articles that he did in terms of the data that came back. And then I want to talk about like just how this whole thing was framed. How did the media frame everything? How did the media discuss this? How did the media deal with the two candidates, or well, three candidates, Humphreys, Gavin, and Connolly, right? And how the media dealt with Maria Steen and all of that kind of thing, right? And then ultimately, I want to kind of discuss like what are the major repercussions out of all of this, right? Because the major repercussions out of all of this, uh, Mackie and Shane says N. Does that mean no sound or what? I think my sound should be coming in just fine. But anyway, yeah, I'll just keep going for the time being. So we have that. The next part I want to then talk about is the basically like I want to do a bit of a deep dive into like there's been this narrative that has been floating around about how the left have had like a major success here, a major success with all of this. And I, quite frankly, I don't think that's true. And then finally, I'm going to talk about spoiling the vote. So I'm going to like link all of these together. And another thing I want to talk about as well is this Irish Times article about from this guy from Stripe, right? John Collison, and about infrastructure and how the civil service works and things like that. I think it's an interesting article to get into. Mainly, like I have a number of kind of disagreements with all of this, but yeah, well, let's get into it. So ultimately, let's start off on a few basic kind of points in this. So first of all, what are the kind of overall numbers for this, right? So Catherine Connolly got 914,143 votes, right? Humphreys got 424,000 and Gavin got 103,568, right? And out of all of that, the spoiled votes ended up surpassing 200,000. So it ended up being 13% of the vote. Now, there's a few kind of different things and assumptions and kind of broad line numbers I'm going to talk about before we get into this, right? So, first thing is that if we take a look at the trend kind of adjusted for the amount of spoiled votes, this election has had the lowest proportion of valid votes in the history of the Irish state. That's how kind of apathetic we're talking here and we're kind of discussing here. So for example, like we're talking about an election whereby 40% of people voted, and out of that 40%, right? Out of that 40% of people voted, like 12.9, 213,000 votes were, spoiled, right? And I would even kind of argue on top of that, with the exception of a handful of like, Fianna Fáil, I'll vote Fianna Fáil no matter what, kind of more loyalist kind of people, for lack of a better phrase. Gavin's vote of 103,000 is a spoiled vote too, right? So basically, we're talking about, if you want to be generous about it, I mean, maybe this is a bit on the high end, but let's just round it off to keep the math simple, right? We're talking essentially about 20% of the vote of the actual vote that was invalid, right? A protest vote for a candidate that resigned, but he was still on the ticket, and actual genuine spoiled votes. So when you take that number down, whittle it down further, you basically have 63.4% of that 40%. And then you have to take out this percentage as well. So basically, ultimately, by the time you break down the numbers further and further, you're talking about a presidential candidate who's been elected with about like fucking 25% of the vote, or from 25% of people. This is not a resounding success by any stretch. This is not a resounding success by any means. And, I mean, I was talking about the kind of leftist vote there. We'll get onto that in a bit. But ultimately, like, this thing has been like a bitter, low energy, cock up for the government in a lot of ways. And I think actually, just to kind of get back to a couple of basic points or kind of previous points on this one, like, I think, like, considering the circumstances, considering Maria Steen being booted off the ticket and all of that, I think that this has worked out quite well. Yeah, I mean, just going back here. Here's a tweet that I want to there's a couple of tweets that I did that I kind of want to reference here. The first one, and this is the other important thing to talk about here, is that I made this point in the last stream I did on the presidential election, and it's just summed up in this tweet here. I did this from a couple of months ago, which is basically, the presidential elections are not typical elections. People are far more likely to vote for the outsider candidate. Think Gallagher in 2011, Casey in 2018, and even if you want to go back to 1990, I have it here. Here's an advertisement that Fianna Fáil put out to kind of keep Mary Robinson out. Is the left right for the park? Do you want radical socialists to run this presidency? If not, vote number 1, Brian Lenihan. My point being is that, like, and I think this election has just kind of just shown that, as that pattern has continued, that Irish people for presidential elections are more likely to do the outsider thing, vote for whomever, go for the kind of mad choice or the weird choice. So, when there's kind of like, when you hear all this kind of talk about, like, Sinn Féin talking about this is a great, glorious victory for the left, there is this other stuff to consider here, I mean, that's one part of this, but then another part of it as well is, if we take a look here, and I'm kind of smiling reading this, because this is a tweet I was responding to someone in terms of, like, how much would it take for a spoiled vote to be a news story? And I said, look, it would need to be a lot, like, and you would bet your dollar to donut that Gavin Riley, RTE, they wouldn't cover it. They tried to ignore it. They tried to kind of move away from it as much as possible. But fucking hell, I mean, when I was thinking about spoiled votes, I was thinking like 5% or 6%. I wasn't thinking like fucking 12 or 13%. And I definitely wasn't thinking, more than Gavin got. I mean, that was the remarkable thing. Like, if you take a look at, like, Fianna Fáil strongholds, spoiled the vote was doing higher than Gavin. That is an incredible result. Like I said, I mean, I think really, I know I've repeated myself here, but considering the circumstances, I think this election went very well, right? I think the least worst candidate got in, Connolly. I think it's majorly affected or impacted the two main political parties. And I think as well, and I'll get onto this kind of when I get into the data a bit, but this is a good tweet from a guy called Jonathan Mills, where he basically just says, like, and I'm inclined to agree with him. He made this good point that, like, the president of Ireland is often represented a dying order, and it's true. Like, if you take a look back at, like, certain presidential nominations, they're often the kind of end of something, the end of an era, the end of a period in Ireland, right? And he references here, like, I really like this tweet. He references here Douglas Hyde, and then you move on to that from De Valera's presidency, representing the end of the early republic, and then Childers, and then Mary Robinson. And he basically just says Connolly will represent the end of the liberal 90s order that began with Robinson. I think, I don't know about you lads, but I think there's this almost sense of finality here. There's an ending here. Like, I mean, this is not Michael D. Higgins in 2011, 2018. This is not Mary McAleese building bridges in 1997. This is nothing like that. This is the most you know, I mean, last just over last week I did a stream on love hate, right? And I was talking about how in that stream that like once Nidge takes over and once Nidge gets to once Love Hate gets to season 4 and beyond, it's kind of over. You know, it takes 12 episodes or whatever to be over, but it's over at that stage. There's a again, maybe I'm wrong here and maybe I'm being overly optimistic. But I think there's a sense of finality to this. And I think the next election is going to be very, very different. But before we get into that even more, I'll talk about some of the data and I'll talk about some of the interesting points here. So we'll discuss the data, and then, like I said, we'll then go into kind of like what are the kind of like issues and how the media kind of discussed all this. So first of all, I think if you want to have a good idea of a lot of what's gone on, you want to take a look at this guy, Kevin Cunningham. He's a stats guy, he's a numbers guy. He's done a lot of interesting work on Irish elections and how they work and the data with them. I've talked about him before. He's done interesting things like personality tests on, you know, giving people like the big 5 personality tests and like trying to work out what, you know, someone who votes the National Party, what's his personality compared to like someone who votes Social Democrats, for example. Very interesting stuff. But he's put together 3 Substack articles here, which I find very interesting and which I find a key to a big chunk of this, right? So, first of all, and this gets into my point on the whole kind of like, you know, this is a big victory for the left, right? He asked a question here. Would you vote for a left alliance of Sinn Féin, Social Democrats, Labour, and People Before Profit at the next election? If you take a look at the data, right? So you've got 3 categories. You've got yes, not sure, depends, and no, right? If you take a look at Heather Humphreys, Jim Gavin, spoiled my ballot. So just to go back here quickly, so 30% plus 7% plus 50%, right? So we've got that 50% number in our head. Let's, again, we're just rounding it off to keep the maths kind of quick. So this lump here, 72, 85, that averages at around 77, 78, right? Percent. Okay, so you get that, right? And then you multiply that by the 0.5 number, right? So basically, we're talking about like 0.8 multiplied by 0.5. Sorry, just doing blah, blah, blah. 40 plus and a bit percent, right? Okay, so I'm kind of rambling with the numbers here, but ultimately, like, the other thing as well, just to kind of emphasize on the data here, there's a not sure, it depends question. So basically, again, maybe I'm being a bit biased and I'm kind of rounding the numbers up here. But like in the case of Heather Humphreys voters, you know, 97% of them do not want to see any sort of left-wing alliance. Jim Gavin, or they're very unsure about it. 94% for Jim Gavin, and for spoiled to vote, 88%. So, you know, even when you kind of break this down in terms of like Connolly's number, like and Connolly's vote, and when you extrapolate that out, like these numbers, like again, you have to add up, like if you want to kind of a good comparison, you need to add up People Before Profit, Social Democrats, Labour, and Sinn Féin as a percentage, and then you need to compare that to the percentages here. And ultimately, what you find is that these numbers are just about the same, if not a bit less than that, right? Depending on what context you want to use, like, you know, the not sure, it depends, right? But for a huge chunk of the vote, and remember, these are the people who voted, right? These are not the kind of like, oh, I'm just going to stay at home people. And I'm just going to stay at home, I'm going to make a reasonable assumption here that they would have belonged more to this group, right? But by the time you start including all of that, like, you know, there is no, or it's not that there's no appetite, but like this has been a trend in Irish politics for a while. I mean, let's take a look here. Here is a Telegram post I put up a few months ago, right? Let's discuss the leftist vote. The leftist vote in this example is defined as Social Democrats, People Before Profit, Green Party, and Labour. In terms of percentage of total seats, their vote has fallen from 18% in 2020 to 15% in 2024. In terms of the percentage of total votes, their vote has fallen from 17% in 2020 to 15% in 2024. Remember, this is not including Sinn Féin, who have done horrendously in these elections. Typo there. The conclusion we can make here is Middle Ireland aside, leftist parties are on the decline and normal people are getting sick of voting for them. And, that's an important kind of thing here because, and that's going to be one result here. I mean, take this guy. I kind of retweeted, kind of responding to him. But basically, this guy is like he's a retired Irish ambassador. All his details are there. You can see them. But the thing is, I thought was interesting is that he has a line here going, "We have an increasingly left-leaning electorate." That's it. No, we don't. I don't think we do at all. But the thing is, I think a big chunk of people in these positions are going to start thinking, well, because of the outstanding success, we need to appeal to people more by, becoming more left. And that's not true at all. I mean, here's another good post from Ben Scannell, which kind of goes into this, right? In 2018, between Michael D. Higgins and Sinn Féin's Leah Ní Riada, left-wing candidates got a combined first preference vote of 916,553. In 2025, Catherine Connolly, backed by Sinn Féin, Social Democrats, Greens, Labour and People Before Profit, got 914,143. There was no surge in new left-wing voters. Yeah, exactly. We can see this in the Cunningham data. We can see this in data from previous elections. And we can see it in what Scannell is talking about here. I mean, I'm not saying that like it was a failure for them. I mean, it's not a blow in the way that it was like Fianna Fáil. I'm not saying that at all. But this kind of, change for Catherine Connolly, a new day. That's not happening. It's not happening at all, right? They basically, and that goes into things like, for example, I've seen the response to like, kind of almost a sort of an aggressive response to when people bring up the spoiled votes, right? And one component of the spoiled votes is the fact that people didn't want to vote for Connolly because they dislike Connolly. There was a component of that spoiled vote group who just out and out dislike Connolly. And we'll get into that more in the data. But ultimately, you can see there is no real, and even only Connolly, like, the big leftist alliance that they talk about, only 50% of people really want it, and then you've got a 46% who are just like, 49, I can't add, who kind of really get into this. So basically, yeah, we move on from here, right? Now, next question is, should the president criticize the government where they feel it is necessary to do so? Again, Catherine Connolly is very, very high on this. The other ones, not as much. Fine Gael people don't want the president criticizing them on anything. Fianna Fáil, not as much. And in the Spalter, valid, kind of similar enough to Connolly. Fine. This one is interesting. Thinking about the economy as a whole, do you think the country is better off or worse off or the same as last year? Now, this is where things get interesting, right? You see a massive, massive disparity between people who spoiled their vote. They think that the country is worse off, 91%, right? And for Catherine Connolly, it is 70%, right? Whereas if you get to the more kind of, for lack of a better phrase, boomer candidates who are doing somewhat well, but also Jim Gavin is a bit high here, which again bolsters up. If some of this is kind of a protest, because the economy is doing worse, which it is, and the fact that Gavin is noticeably higher than Humphreys, that kind of leads into my hypothesis, for lack of a better phrase, that some of the Gavin stuff actually is a protest vote, right? And then we get into this part here. Which is the following was the most important in making your choice, right? And then you get to integrity and honesty for Connolly, values and ideology. Again, kind of a bit more kind of flat. Competence and qualifications, communications and demeanor. That was high for her. But the thing is, right, which I thought was particularly interesting, is the integrity and honesty one, because the integrity and honesty one, basically, I would almost kind of read that one, if people are kind of answering this subconsciously, they would be kind of thinking like, can you kind of reflect and talk about kind of my interest in a way that resonates with me, right? And then we get to this part here, which is quite interesting. Which of the following is more important to you: the candidates or the parties backing them? Connolly, Voter, Humphreys, and Gavin. Basically, once you start getting down here, like it becomes more of the kind of Humphreys Gavin vote becomes more of a kind of anything but Connolly against the other candidate than actually kind of voting for the candidate. So again, if you're seeing numbers like this, it kind of translates into kind of like a low energy kind of bored thing, but at the same time, some which is going to have quite significant events. So we'll move on to a bit more data, which I thought was interesting. There's a breakdown in terms of like who are the people who spoiled their ballot and why. Okay. Now, the main reasons were kind of put down as lack of choice, didn't like the candidates, undemocratic. And again, just to go back to here, you match back up, I would say, the undemocratic stuff with the integrity and honesty stuff, and you start to get a little bit of a picture here. So basically, lack of choice, didn't like the candidates, undemocratic process, anti-government protest, general spoiled ballot statement, and the part I wanted to skip down here to was this. Okay, so we also asked the question about why people spoiled their vote, whether that was because the candidate did not represent their views or whether the candidates were not good enough. This speaks more directly to the distinction as to whether people were merely unsatisfied with the options available or whether there was something more ideological than what had been referred to above as a democratic deficit. And that, once you break down that number, what you get is 60%, right? A democratic deficit. What views, one might ask, when we break down these figures down according to the left-right self-placement of respondents, it is clear to see that these voters, or spoiled voters, lean heavily towards the right of the political spectrum. And you can see that there, that basically, like, you know, if you broke down this kind of question, that in terms of like the candidates not represent my views, right-wing voters, or what they classify as right-wing, is much more in the they did not represent my views. And that's the thing. I've been talking about this a lot for the entire year that I've been doing streams, whether it's Stormy Owen, whether it's talking about TV shows like Love Hate or whatever, that the disparity between the political establishment and a lot of institutions and the average person is growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And it has been for quite a few years, I would say. But it's all starting to kind of culminate in this. But anyway, let's move on from that. Late on in the campaign, Maria Steen had become the most high-profile candidate, and it is perhaps unsurprising, therefore, that she was far and away the most popular choice of who decided to spoil the ballot, right? Who are they? Who are the spoiled voters? First, in terms of voting behaviour, you'll see the sentiment is mainly to the right of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. In fact, relatively few Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael voters spoiled their ballot. While undoubtedly some will focus on the other right, here this is actually a relatively small subset of the overall population. The biggest groups of people who spoiled their ballot were people who had voted for independence at the last election, followed by Aon Tú and Sinn Féin. And the Sinn Féin point, just to go back here, which I don't know if I didn't mention it there, but basically it's just interesting that the this, even though there's a ton of you know, would you vote for a left alliance before at the next election? I just thought it was interesting that that is somewhat actually lower than the other two, because you would kind of go, oh, you know, leftists, not all of them. So basically, this number here, logically speaking, if Sinn Féin are represented higher in the spoiled ballots, and if this is a thing, that this 72% is lower than these numbers, then it must be the case that, like, to some degree, there's a lot of, or to some degree, quite a few unhappy Sinn Féin, especially compared to other people who spoiled the vote. And there is. Basically, 11% of them spoiled their ballot. So again, you know, even within the kind of like, you know, oh, it's a sweeping success for the leftist parties, you can see Sinn Féin are overrepresented here. You know, there's also another category like other left and all that kind of thing, but that's just kind of an interesting thing that is found out. But yeah, basically Aon Tú, Independent Ireland, Independence, and the so-called other right, you know, your NP or whatever would be in there. were massively overrepresented in the spoiled ballot part. The people who spoiled their ballot were relatively middle-aged, and this stuff is interesting as well. Aside from a spike among younger men, this pattern is consistent with a broader left-right divergence among younger men and younger women. Indeed, in this election, the strongest level of support for Connolly was among younger women. That said, it would be wrong to say young men are far right and young women are far left. Young men were still far more likely to support Catherine Connolly than any other option. But these numbers are staggering to me. Like, so basically, like in terms of the spoiled vote, right? 8% of women, 18 to 34-year-old, 25% of men, age 18 to 34. And even though that flattens out as you get kind of older and older, and it even kind of flips when you get to the 65% group, I think that's a pretty incredible statistic. Again, just continuing on reading this, again, I'd like to write more extensively on this divergence on another occasion. That divergence, by the way, has been happening across the West, whereby like women have been kind of voting in the same or for more kind of left-wing liberal parties, and men are becoming much more right-wing. That's something you're seeing across the West. Most of it reflects growing dissatisfaction among young men, which used to be just among young, disaffected, working-class men. You know, example, BNP, EDL, Jobbik, but this disaffection has spread to young middle-class men. The Spoiled Vote campaign was one which benefited from online engagement, particularly X, as cited from one of their campaign's proponents. Of those who had been on X within 24 hours of voting, 21% spoiled their vote. TikTok also influential in this regard. And that's one of the major things I would say that has come out of this election. Whether, you know, wherever you kind of are on the political spectrum, right? The thing is with this election is that there was a plan, basically, and the plan was ultimately along the lines of this, right? Let me just get the tweet here. Basically, it was sort of this. The presidential campaign elections are not typical election. People are far likely to vote for the outsider candidate. Think Gallagher in 2011 or Casey in 2018. The plan was we wanted to be boring, low turnout. Fine Gael boomers will support Heather Humphreys. We keep everyone else out. We just, you know, go through the formalities. We know what the statement here that I've said. We think that's true. We don't want a Maria Steen in. We don't want a Conor McGregor in. We just keep it flat, keep it boring, and we'll use the RTE and media bias to keep out Connolly and anyone else, and we're out the door. And that obviously backfired hugely. That backfired hugely for a few reasons. I mean, one of them was Humphreys was a terrible choice. And let me go into the reason why Humphreys was a terrible choice, right? One of the major reasons why Humphreys is a terrible choice is because there's a number of topics with a lot of Irish people that, like, you know, if you disagree with them, or if you kind of have a contrarian view on these ones, you know, you're going to find yourself isolated pretty quickly. I mean, one of them is, you know, Israel and Palestine and being like anti-Palestine. That will alienate you from most Irish people pretty quickly. But one of them, and Fine Gael have done this a number of times, whether it's Varadkar commemorating the Black and Tans, or, you know, Neil Richmond turning up at Orange Order parades and things like that. The whole kind of orange connection to Humphreys is something that just rubs Irish people the wrong way. And, you know, that was easy to predict and see. And they did try and kind of hide it and kind of like not talk about it enough, but eventually people were talking about it all the time. That was one of the mistakes they made with this. But then there's more. But anyway, I want to just go back onto just a couple of other points. I still need to discuss some more of the data, but ultimately, the thing I just wanted to kind of zoom in one last time is just really the age group thing, right? That if you kind of really drill into this, there is a huge difference between men and women in terms of voting for Catherine Connolly and in terms of the spoiled vote, especially among younger people. So at the younger age groups, it was mostly men. And in terms of voting for Catherine Connolly, 81% of 18 to 34-year-old women voted for her. That figure falls to 51% when it's men. So it's not just a kind of a disaffected voter thing, it's a disaffected young man voter issue, right? And, like, just to kind of go off on a ramble about that, we can talk about economics and we can talk about all the kind of issues and like the fact that the economy is not doing well. That they talk about kind of like line go up or whatever, but the line is not going up for a lot of people. The economy has, in certain areas, noticeably deteriorated, right? Just looking through the comments there. Orange T 3 AM says like Korea when men are the right and the left is just women. Yeah, and the same thing has happened exactly in this election, and the kind of disparity there is going to lead to kind of like various political things. I mean, the main one is that like you're going to see more of kind of a schism, I would say, between the kind of like women going into places more like the Social Democrats, and then kind of men going in that kind of more right wing direction. But we are really starting to see that manifest here, and we're starting to see this manifest in this election, right? So, yeah, I mean, but just to go back to my kind of like point there that before I kind of finish off that, sorry, I'm a little bit all over the place, but the point I wanted to make there was if we take a look at the plan, like I was saying, we just want Heather Humphreys in, nice and boring, keep everyone else out. The issues or the things with that is that they did actively try and keep Connolly out, right? So if we take a look here, I got this image off somewhere, right? But we can see here it's a snip of like multiple Irish Independent, Sunday Independent articles going like, basically going against Connolly, right? This may not be the presidential choice we would want, but it's the one we must make. David Quinn, I don't want to vote for Heather Humphreys, but I'm left with little choice. John Byrne, spoiling my vote is not an empty gesture. It is the only way to express my anger. Eilish O'Hanlon, Catherine Connolly's imminent win should be a wake-up call, but it won't be heeded. Regina Lavelle, I want to punish a government, but electing Catherine Connolly would be an act of national self-sabotage. Maria Cahill, what would be a champion of women's rights like Catherine Connolly, be happy with Gerry Adams' support. We get to another guy here, John Lee. If Connolly stood on Galway Shop Street and, it'd be likely she'd still win. She may be about to win, and she almost certainly will not agree, but the way the far-left candidate has glided past repeated controversies this election is very Trump-esque. I mean, like, this is, whatever you say about her, and, I would be in agreement with you on most of it. Like, there was an active attempt to, like, keep her out. Again, if you go back over the past few weeks, and again, if you take a look at, say, the voting data, right? Again, you ask yourself, what's the probability of, like, if only 29% voted for Humphreys, but all of these journalists are kind of coming out as pro Humphreys, there's something kind of interesting going on here. I mean, here's another example from another tweet. Here's another Alison O'Connor, Catherine Connolly more suited to the student union in the Áras, from our stance on Ukraine to our associations with Gemma O'Doherty. Then it cuts off there. But ultimately speaking, like, it goes into the kind of system that we have, that basically you are not, you have to agree with absolutely everything, and you have to be on board with absolutely everything. And even if there's a couple of topics you disagree on us on, like the triple lock or whatever, we don't want you. We want Heather Humphreys, and we're going to, Fine Gael's, marketing department is going to put out videos of her, talking about how much she loves her grandchildren. And the idea then will that boomers will be like, I can relate, and I'm going to vote for her, and that's it. But any kind of like contrarian opinion on this, they were kind of willing to just push people out on. And in terms of that, they would actively prefer, yes, they would prefer someone like Connolly to Maria Steen. There's no question on that. But at the same time, in terms of like, you want a president, you want to rubber stamp some legislation, you want to get it over the line, you don't want any controversy, all of that, then yeah, like that's what's kind of happening. Like, like I said before, the system is becoming increasingly calcified and trying to protect itself all the time, right? I mean, we could even kind of expand on that further. I mean, if we want to go back here to Michael McDowell's article here, right? Why I didn't nominate Maria Steen for the presidency, right? I just want to focus in on kind of one paragraph here, and it just the main reason it just kind of backs up what I'm kind of saying here, what they were kind of worried about with all of this, right? Which is this one here is I have been elected as Shannon Éireann on 3 occasions after standing as a Liberal Republican candidate. My record as a parliamentarian since 1987 has been consistently Liberal on social and economic matters. I have taken the Liberal side in successive referendums such as the divorce, marriage, equality, Oireachtas powers, and the repeal of the 8 Amendments. I've consistently supported Liberal causes as a member of Dáil Éireann and Shannon Éireann since my first election to the Oireachtas in 1987. In the care and family referendums, I advocated rejection of the government's proposals from the same Liberal perspective. I was careful in my advocacy to avoid denominational or conservative arguments. I mean, this one is really amazing to me because it's almost kind of like, should something kind of be good in and of itself and work in and of itself, and the whole kind of denominational or conservative part doesn't necessarily come into it, if that makes sense, right? But my point being is that, like, they were aware from a kind of a symbology point of view, like what would happen here. And the idea was just to kind of just, keep everything coasting. You were supposed to vote for Humphreys, keep everything kind of happy, right? And amazingly, despite all of that, despite all the kind of like media stuff like this that was coming out at the same time, coming out with the same kind of points, right? And despite all that kind of RTE backing, it failed. It failed completely. And that's going to be like, again, if we go back to the data here, like in terms of like the spoils campaign, this is out of all the elections I've kind of watched and monitored and whatnot, the impact that RTE has had, the impact that the Irish Times has had, it's never been this bad. I've never seen like and again, I was watching the coverage of all of this, the people talking about spoil your vote, and the debates and whatnot and all of that. And in those debates they were protecting Humphreys, not Connolly. In all of this, in terms of like the RTE machine, the media machine, I've never seen it perform so poorly, even among kind of older people, even among boomers. It really has. You are seeing signs now, and even some of the data here kind of shows that whole thing is basically starting to fail, right? So yeah, we're 35 minutes in and I still have a couple of more points to get through, but basically, yeah, it's a real failure. It's a hell of a thing that's going on right now. And just going back to kind of like the kind of fakeness of it, I thought looking at all of this and kind of watching all of this and watching and hearing the topics that they were discussing and talking about, you know, there was nothing interesting being said. There was no depth. There was no talking about kind of major issues that are going on in the country right now and will go on. I mean, there was no talk about kind of the infrastructure issues that I've talked about for years now. There was no talk about you know, the impact of what AI is going to do, and even the potential kind of economic bubbles that are arising, an AI economic bubble that might be arising right now. I'm not going to talk about that in the stream, but like, there was no real kind of analysis of like, geopolitical events, young people leaving, all of these kind of things. Like, even the way that, like, when the coverage of this started, like, when I was watching the debates, there was almost this kind of thing, and someone pointed it out to me that, like, almost at the start, like with a lot of questioning from a lot of these journalists, the questioning was basically along the lines of like, how did you vote in this referendum? Did you agree with the government on this? How did you vote with them? And it just turned into kind of like a, almost kind of like a scoping exercise whereby, like, there was supposed to be kind of a right answer and a wrong answer. And, if you didn't vote in 2015 and 2018 the correct way, or within other circumstances, then yeah, you basically got kind of the idea was to kind of like kick you out or ostracize you, basically. And but despite all that, none of it seems to have worked really. I mean, even what I thought was interesting, right, was that a number of actually major, and I would say semi-serious, like the serious scandals in terms of like Catherine Connolly came up, right? And one of them was, well, two of them, right? One of them was like she hired somebody who basically had a criminal charge in relation to having a gun, right? And then the other one was she basically did barrister work for bank repossession of people's homes, right? Now, if you kind of like zoom back to, the thing that kind of like caused Jim Gavin to implode a bit, right? The thing that caused Jim Gavin to implode was basically he owed about €3,000 to, I think it was a tenant, wasn't it? That basically he didn't pay back. Now, from a presidential point of view, what's worse, right? Not paying back, and by the way, obviously these things, none of these things are good, right? But what's worse, not paying 3 grand back to someone, or you know, potentially compromising a position by hiring someone of a dubious background, or overseeing people being kicked out of out of their houses and evicted, and all the consequences from that in the early 2010s when people were suffering immensely. Like probably the 3,000 thing is probably not as bad as those two things in a way, right? And yet it's bad, obviously. And yet these things didn't stick with her. I mean, just to go back to this point here, if Connolly stood on Galway Shop Street, you get the picture there, you can see it. That's the headline. But you know, that told me, or that kind of tells you that, like, if that is the reaction, that people didn't care, that the anger, especially from that young working class man cohort that we saw in the data earlier, right, is well, women as well, right? But that kind of anger, right, on the spoiler vote and the Catherine Connolly side, right, is so strong that when you're, think about it from kind of your own perspective. Like, if you have a dislike of someone, or even if you have a like of someone, if you dislike someone, small issues become bigger issues, or if you like someone, bigger issues can become smaller issues, right? And it really was the case that like people's feelings against Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil had gotten to such a position especially among younger people, but younger people are becoming more split down the middle, like I was talking about there, that those issues can just be kind of almost ignored, shrugged off. That tells you the level of animosity at the very least, and downright hatred of the two main parties at the very most, right? And it just kind of continues on and on with this. So, for example, like, you know, um, it just kind of continues on and on with this. So, yeah, it's just been fascinating to watch and kind of read up on all of this. But in terms of kind of like just my main last couple of points there, just kind of rooting back to this, one of the striking things to kind of just get back to the Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael stuff, one of the striking things with all of this has been how, and I'm repeating myself a little bit with the Humphrey stuff, but how incredibly, awfully, strangely incompetent, the two main parties have become in relation to this. Now, I mean, this trend has been playing out, especially as well since since the 2024 referendums. But you know, the way that they tried to deal with this, I mean, one of the ones that really surprised me actually was, if you remember when Simon Harris was elected in 2024, when he replaced Varadkar, and into the local elections, Harris was coming out with stuff like, we need a common sense immigration policy, right? And we know from the data, right, that for example, here's one here. I did a stream on this before, but it's basically kind of Electoral Commission Red C poll data. you know, attitudes on immigration. There should be strict limits on the number of immigrants coming into Ireland. 73% agree. Immigrants are good for Ireland's economy, yada, yada, yada. Ethnic minorities should adapt to Ireland's way of life. All of that. But the kind of point I just wanted to zoom in with in terms of the incompetence is that all they had to do to deal with Connolly was basically just go something along the lines of this, right? And again, I was watching for them to do this, but I don't think they can anymore. And we'll talk about why they can't. But all they had to do is go, at Fine Gael, we support a common sense, fair immigration policy. But the thing is, right, with Catherine Connolly, she's an open borders person, right? What do you say to that, Connolly? Because the people of Ireland are very concerned with this. We want a firm, fair, good for our economy, Fine Gael approach, right? And if Catherine Connolly basically just said, Catherine Connolly said, like, oh, yeah, no, you're right. We do need a firm but fair immigration policy. If she said that, she would have been eaten alive by, the left coalition thing behind her, right? She would have been gone. And if she said, like, oh, I really support, like, no, like, I think, she did that a bit more, like, if she was kind of more interrogated and questioned on that, no, she did speak more along those lines. But if she kind of was pressed on that issue more and more and more, she would have definitely kind of imploded a bit more. I mean, that's like immigration is like the main issue, like it really has changed like that with people speaking, like in terms of pubs, in terms of like day to day. Like this is the major issue that's on people's minds right now. And yeah, that's the thing, because ultimately the question then becomes, how are they responding to this, and why have they responded to this in this way? And the answer being is that these parties, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, and whatnot, and all these institutions have essentially been hollowed out. There is a very good Burkean article here I want to talk about. Everyone should read this, and again, it's worthy of a few things I did in terms of like what exactly has happened to Fianna Fáil once Martin got in. But yeah, let me just grab a glass of water there. Yeah, there we go. Been speaking for 48 minutes straight, so I needed something there. But we're going to read a bit of this, right? Because there's this whole kind of talk about like Martin being in trouble and Martin being booted out and whatnot. But again, I'm not going to dominate the entire stream with this, but I think it is important to understand how important Martin is and what exactly Micheál Martin did to Fianna Fáil, right? So basically, we're going to skip down to here, right? Okay. We're going to start reading from here. So, whereas Fianna Fáil ministers once had to assuage paranoia against the imposition of abortion from Brussels, Martin and his cabinet now sign off on exclusion zones, specifically targeting silent prayer outside clinics offering the procedure just last year. Following in the footsteps of multiple European Christian democratic parties, which have been hijacked, retrofitted, and worn as a political skin suit for liberal careerists, Fianna Fáil is very much different from the wreck of a party that Martin inherited 14 years ago. The genesis of Martin's overhaul lies in the months before, during, and after the 2011 election, which saw a whole generation of the party leadership depart. Making a conscious effort to break with the past, Martin was meticulous in the party shedding its old boy image through, nice use of the word there, through the careful selection of a female front bench, often including county councillors rather than sitting TDs. Brown envelopes are out, gender quotas and a new metrosexual outlooks were in. The grassroots, still in with their heads spinning from the electoral hammering of 2011, nodded along obsequiously. Steadfast in this process was now the party general secretary and Bertie Ayres Senate appointee Sean Dorgan. Sean Dorgan is one of the most important people in politics no one talks about in this country over the past 15-20 years. Effectively pensioning off an older generation of often more conservative Fianna Fáil backroom men, it was this detoxification process in the eyes of Dorgan and the Martin leadership that set in motion the decade of hyper-liberalisation that we see the end product of today. A Smurfit Business School graduate rubbing shoulders with Ray McSherry, Dorgan's rise to prominence came amid a wider centralisation of the party away from the grassroots common structure into a model favouring Arás de Valera. Rather privately, the Fianna Fáil grassroots and county council rank and file have been quite an embarrassment to party HQ, with the 2010 seeking a new emphasis on female and LGBT candidates, often leading to in-house accusations of a, don't know if that's YouTube safe, but whatever, operational at a safe level. Hardly a paradigm for the hard right, nonetheless the Ahern years saw a broad-based coalition pulling the lever for the party, spanning working-class dubs, rural Gombeans and nouveau rich developers, a far cry from the more sanitised progressive vision envisaged by Martin and Dorgan. Declaring Fianna Fáil as being a centre-left alternative to apparently more pro-business Fine Gael, Dorgan is regarded as the man behind the throne in the waning months of the Martin leadership. This process of scrubbing the party top brass was assisted by Fianna Fáil strategist Deirdre Gallan and Deputy General Secretary Pat McParland, with Martin himself adamant in completing the liberalisation process through his dauphin, Jack Chambers. And prior to the last few months, Jack Chambers was clearly the guy that was going to be groomed as the next Taoiseach, right? That's not going to happen now. In other words, Martin and Dorgan have basically hollowed out their own party to such a degree that they can't respond to problems anymore. Like, the thing I basically was talking about there about the idea of, you know, using genuine concerns to kind of like talk about Connolly or whatever, this is gone. The people who could come up with these ideas are now gone. They've been kicked out of the system. And, you know, you don't even need something like what happened with the, you know, youth wing of Aintu a couple of days ago. You don't need that. Once, you know, organizations and people and groups are built on priors about the world. And once your priors stop lining up with reality, that's when things start to break down. And so what Fianna Fáil has become and what Fine Gael have become husks of themselves, organizations that cannot look beyond any of this. So when they're looking at this and they're kind of wondering why working class men who are angry with the system are spoiling their vote and why they're listening to like Michael McCarthy or Keith Woods or whatever, why are they doing this? The response will be, well, it must be because the voting procedure to get on the ticket is unfair. Therefore, maybe, just maybe, we should consider a referendum on it. But it's got little to do with that because, like, first of all, from a technical and mathematical point of view, the requirement of half the councils and 20 members of the Oireachtas, because the size of the Oireachtas has increased, it's mathematically easier to get on the ticket than ever before. In theory, right? In theory. And then second of all, why was this not a problem in 2018? Why was this not a problem in 2011? Why is this only a problem to people now? And the reason being is that the disparity between the political class and average people has just grown to such a gargantuan degree, gargantuan depth, and these parties have been hollowed out. These parties are finished. You know, I mean, like they are on the decline in some shape or form. I mean, like back in like the 80s or the 90s, like Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were like combined were like 80-90% of the vote. I mean, with this election, they could barely hit like, you know, they were 35-36% of the vote. You know, and again, I know it's presidential and I know it's kind of a kind of a result of this, but Orange Team says, I expect a Fianna Fáil Fine Gael merger in the future. I mean, they've essentially merged anyway. I mean, like, even like I should have mentioned that, but like half the original plan before Gavin was booted was basically going to be that, like, you know, they'd have their own votes and they transfer, and then Connolly would lose out on the transfer. That obviously didn't happen when Gavin started to implode, although I have a few theories on what exactly happened with Gavin, but I don't think they're as kind of relevant here. Shinnok 1916 says, I'd like to view IPAS as akin to gasoline, an absolute detrimental policy which will have decades of consequences but can't be avoided without a. Well, no, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I mean, I brought it up before about like Denmark. I mean, you know, this has been solved by other countries, like, um, but yeah, I mean, ultimately it's a bit more complicated than that. But yeah, 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 just kind of thinking out loud there. But ultimately speaking, these parties have been kind of just hollowed out, and they've been kind of coasting on this, this Fine Gael post 2011 kind of brand of like, things are going well, and we've got like gay marriage in referendums and things are fine. But like now that you know the landscape is different, geopolitical events are different, the economy is different. I mean, for example, I before I kind of went on stream there, I heard something that basically Amazon was going to cut 30,000 jobs, right? Things like that. Like, where is the plan? Where is the ideas? Where is the morale? Where is the motivation? And that's the thing. Like, once you start hollowing out these organizations, and once you start, you know, almost kind of like wearing a skin suit of them, what happens is you get into this stuff. And that's where I wanted to kind of almost finish off here, because this is the epitome of how they view this. Because when they take a look at this election, in terms of like the kind of like under data that I've been showing you, like, the Kevin Cunningham data on like, the differences between men and women, different, working class men, 18 to 35-year-olds, like just voting massively disproportionate in the spoiled, what that tells you about the economy, what that tells you about society, you know, you can't like, when you have these kind of views of the world, like you can't, you can't think in this way, right? So then it turns into stuff like this. It turns into, you know, arguments about bureaucracy and regulation and whatnot. And to be clear, right? To be clear, the overregulation of a lot of Irish society and institutions is it is a real thing. I mean, now, I mean, some of that is like, our societies have become more and more complex. You actually do need groups of people to manage that complexity, right? And there are other issues as well, that like, once you set up bureaucracy, people who do well in bureaucracies can expand bureaucracies, and so bureaucracies almost kind of naturally expand over time. There's things like that. But like this article here, again, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it gets into the kind of like Progress Ireland stuff, the guys who were talking about solving the housing crisis by, that's an example of the priors thing. The solution to the housing crisis is to build garden sheds whereby, people can live in nice garden sheds, right? Whereas it doesn't get into the foundations of like why exactly the housing crisis has kind of come about, right? But the part I kind of want to focus here on, I mean, there's a few parts I want to focus in on with this, is basically, well, I mean, first of all, with this, and this is a very good article. There's actually a number of fantastic points in it, but it again, it goes back to the priors, it goes back to the solutions. I mean, John Collison, the Stripe lads are extremely, they're fucking like 500 IQ points more than me anyway, although that wouldn't be hard. But like, it really kind of just gets into these kind of points here. Like, but again, it just, when you kind of whittle it down, what's the conclusion? What's the solution? How do we view the problem? It's a very different thing. So basically, like this, right? I'll get into more examples, but this part I'm highlighting here with my mouse, right? Dublin's water network is going to reach limits in the next 3 years, which will limit future housing construction. Ireland's household electricity prices are the highest in Europe. It is 41% fewer trains, roads, and other transport infrastructure per capita than high-income European countries, and it has the lowest proportion of electrified rail of any EU member state. All right, well, let's break this down for a bit, right? Let's break this down. So, electrical grid, right? We are becoming more and more dependent on interconnectors from the UK, from France, and there's a deal signed off with Spain, right? Uh, Plants like Shannon Bridge and Lanesborough have been shut down, although it was reversed. The idea of having a LNG terminal in Shannon was put down until it was that decision to kind of rebuild it has been reversed, which is good. Uh, Excavation in terms of like oil and gas in places like Barry Row, things like that. Licenses to kind of drill. Peter Ryan has a good article, Drill Bio Drill, if you want to kind of read into that stuff. Nuclear power. I mean, a 2,000 megawatt plant, nuclear power plant. The reason I'm kind of babbling on about the energy stuff here is that the priors of this, I'm basing them on the fact that, like, if we go back to 2022, and if we go back to one of the reasons why our energy prices are so high, one of the major reasons among many, but one of the major reasons is the war in Ukraine, right? If you remember back to that, then hold on 1 second here. I just need to change something. Okay, I think we're good. Let me just try something here. Sorry, just a little technical issue there in mind. But my point being is that, like, those issues that I just kind of discussed there, right? Those stem from the fact that, like, the Ukraine stuff has basically shown that, like, our energy grid is potentially a bit more unstable and more prone to kind of issues that happen in Europe than we would like. Now, what is the solution to that? Try and become some bit more energy dependent, and we don't have to kind of rely on these, interconnectors as much. But again, you don't, that whole kind of like spectrum of kind of seeing, it's basically like a careerist, we're looking forward to Europe. Europe will take care of us. That attitude, and it's not a good one to have. But anyway, I'm kind of getting dragged down on these points here. Despite Ireland's population growth, it remains one of the least densely populated countries in Western Europe. It is talent and money, absolutely. We are a high trust society, absolutely. Well, that's getting worse, but we are one. What's stopping Ireland from building what it needs to have the highest living standards in the world? Ireland's shortage of housing and infrastructure didn't come from nowhere. Here are some specific projects Ireland fumbled. The Grid West transmission project linking Dublin to the Windy West was shelved in 2017. Just skipping down here, just list through a bunch of projects. Why can't Ireland just do things? It's not for want of money. For the past 10 years at least, we have plenty of money. To be sure, investment did fall after the bailout, resulting in important projects being shelved and a slow ramp up thereafter. But in the grand scheme of the last 30 years, Ireland has been able to afford the projects it is needed. NIMBYs are a popular target and they deserve our scorn. Uniquely, in developed countries, our system makes it easy for them by giving anyone legal standing to object to development. Unrelated, third-party objectors have successfully blocked many thousands of homes and hundreds of megawatts of clean energy. But local opposition to development is not by itself the main bottleneck. If it were, we'd expect to see big protests against new projects or intense debate in council chambers. But we don't. Instead, restrictions in the form of planning policies emerge from a mysterious process involving officials from local authorities, the Department of Housing, and the Office of the Planning Regulator. This happens from the public eye. The national debate over Shomree, that's the garden shed thing, was one of the rare occasions in which a specific planning measure was debated publicly, and the Irish public were remarkably supportive of allowing this kind of development. Were they, though? I disagree with that. That tells us something about who is controlled the rest of the time. Is a lack of political will to blame? No, and I'll get on what the point is here. There's something to this. The state's responses to COVID and Brexit showed it as a higher gear than we usually use. But Irish politicians are not out of touch with the electorate. They knew all about the housing and infrastructure shortages. They knew they're on the hook. They know they're on the hook. I don't agree with any of that stuff, by the way. I don't think they're in touch with the electorate. The building of homes, and that's the main problem here, the building of homes has been in the government's top 3 policy priorities for at least 5 years. In that time, money, attention, and political capital has been lavished on housing and infrastructure. But the problem remains stubbornly unsolved. This suggests there's something else going on. The answer is that our process is to decide on what gets built, and where have broken down. These decisions are now made by bodies that do not and cannot think holistically about the task we have set them. Um, it's easy to see how we got here. The generation of leaders in the 1980s and 1990s have a lot to answer for. The legacy of the likes of Charlie Haughey, Bertie Ahern, and Ray Burke were to permanently damage the public's trust in politicians. In Haughey's heyday, look, Haughey was a massively corrupt man, but I don't know about you, but I don't remember public trust collapsing so much that 13% of people spoiled their votes during presidential elections during that time. But, let's continue. In Haughey's heyday, Irish politicians had a lot of power. Ministers could wave through big projects, micromanage their departments, directly appoint allies to big jobs, set budgets as they saw fit, chat freely with lobbyists, procure what they wanted and from whom they wanted it, control local councils, and even appoint judges. This was a system that was capable of doing new things quickly. Haughey brought about the IFSC and Temple Bar in one term. In 2006, we built 93,419 homes. Between 2000 and 2015, we built 895 kilometres of motorway, Dublin's Airport Terminal 2, the Jack Lynch Tunnel, and the Port Tunnel. But it was also, as we know all too well, a system open to abuse. In reaction to the scandals of the 1990s and the 2000s, huge amounts of discretionary power were confiscated from politicians and given to officials, regulators, and agencies. Now, again, with the prior stuff, it's kind of like it's kind of a mix of things. It's kind of like the idea that, like, in certain ways, that like the 80s and the 90s were corrupt or uniquely corrupt compared to now. And I'm not saying corruption didn't exist then, and there was quite a bit in certain ways, but again, like, you're trying to tell me that, like, some Fianna Fáil guy who took a backhander in the 1980s is more corrupt than normal Irish people waking up to having an iPass center in their town. That countries like Denmark have kind of went, we want to avoid that because we want to, we listen to people, right? You see what I mean here? Like, it's like the assumptions are basically built on, like, the 80s, 90s were like this uniquely corrupt, bad kind of situation here. But anyway, again, I'm kind of going off the point here. A crackdown on corruption is one thing, but that's not the only thing going on here. In the past 25 years, there has been a proliferation of regulators, departments, agencies, and NGOs. Since 2000, we've created 303 new government agencies, quangos, or departments, compared to 74 in the prior 25 years. We've got more new government agencies and at a faster rate than we get episodes of Top Gear. The bit I want to stick down to, or scroll down to, yeah, he just goes on about, like, how this has happened in other countries. But this is the bit, right? There are 4 reasons it's a bad idea to leave the running of the country to agencies and officials. Indeed, there are probably more. The first reason is that these agencies aren't directly accountable to the public. This presents a problem regardless of whether they're good or bad. Agencies should be accountable to the public that pay their salaries. In Ireland, the HSE is classed with the Health Minister over its inability to control spending. The Road Safety Authority is being in continual conflict with the Minister for Transport. A 2014 report enhanced accountability with this newly empowered civil service was killed with incredible speed. That's actually another thing we can talk about as well. There's a good guy on Twitter called Fianna Fact, and he's talked about, like, how the kind of councils work and, like, how they were reshaped, even in terms of, like, maybe it wasn't him, but, like, how basically Pascal Donoghue and Fine Gael changed a lot of the structure of these departments in, like, 2015 and 2016 with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. But we're getting off the point here. The second is that these agencies have values and goals of their own, and these values are somewhat out of step with the rest of the country. The NTA had decided not to expand road capacity in Dublin. The Department of Housing has decided to intentionally depopulate the east of the country. On Comishún, Planalda has blocked demolition of old concrete ramps at Dublin Airport. 228 homes were blocked in Killarney because they would interrupt the commute of a roost of horseshoe bats. Who signed up for this? The third problem with government by agency is that agencies can't make trade-offs. If the pursuit of their goal blocks something else important, well, that's not within their remit. So we have the state-funded Antasca blocking the Galway Ring Road, the M3 motorway, and the Shannon LNG scheme. Uh, yeah, okay, we'll move on. We have officials at Fingal County Council throttling flights out of Dublin Airport. Inland Fisheries Ireland blocks flood remediation works. The Heritage Council is blocking the demolition of a wall for the N2 bypass. And then the combinational complexity between overlapping state bodies create logjam. Irish Water, Waterways Ireland, ESB, Airgrid, and the EPA each have jurisdiction over different bits of the Shannon. Now, the bit I want to get into there before I kind of discuss those points is that here we go. Here we go. We need to reverse the continued reassignment of power in Ireland and many countries around the world from elected politicians to the civil service and agencies. We should not leave the state on autopilot with different trade-offs being avoided and chronic problems unfixed. We should not conflate constrained power with good governments. We should shift from looking at our agencies' missions, which are soothing and well written, to scrutinizing their real world impact. We should notice that environmental goals have created stasis, planning has turned into the tyranny of the minority veto, and proactive city design has simply ceased. Process has been allowed to take precedence over outcomes. I notice a common meme in Irish political discourse that our politicians and government are corrupt. They are not. I would disagree with that. Ireland tends to come out in the near top of global anti-corruption measures, such as Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. It isn't the 1980s anymore, although apparently, and they admitted we could do stuff in the 1980s. We can trust our leaders with more power, and they should feel emboldened to use it to deliver it for their citizens. We shouldn't try to keep trying to hamstring them even more. There you go. There you go. Like I said, what is the combination? How does this relate back to the presidential election? It relates back to this. These groups and institutions have been hollowed out. They've been hollowed out because, like with Martin, kicking a lot of right-wing Fianna Fáil people out of his party, they've been hollowed out because of compliance and agreeability. And again, with kind of like broken priors. If you have a system whereby you can't just make these simple decisions, you have to come to these big, grand, intellectual, complex ways of justifying everything you do. This is feeding into, among many things, into why the whole system has kind of blown up in this kind of massively bloated, complex way. And whether it's Varadkar talking about we should bypass the constitution to fix the housing issue, this is basically, this article here is a giant justification of giving more power to politicians, right? That's what this article is. And that's the exact view that they approach with all this stuff. And that's the exact view that they approach with the presidential election. The presidential election is ours. You pick our candidate. We're going to keep out people that we don't want. And the ones who are kind of mostly like us, but disagree with us on a couple of things, like Catherine Connolly, we're going to try and, we're going to try and go after them with a lot of journalists who want to become government advisors. You know what I mean? So that is basically where we're at with this. I mean, yeah, we're coming up to 1 hour and 15. We'll try and kind of shut this down soon, but I just want to emphasize this point as well. And I know I've kind of talked about it before on different streams, that basically how, for example, if you go onto university campuses, the Social Democrats, the hardest, the kind of main big elite university in the country, right? The most popular party is the Social Democrats by 40%, right? Whereas the national support for Social Democrats is 9 or 10%. So ultimately, again, it just feeds into this kind of schism that when they look at this, when they look at the presidential election, right, they're not looking at it on like in terms of people, why did they spoil their votes, right? They think it's kind of really just like, oh, it's just like, or they might read something like this, and there is obviously an element of truth to this, like, oh, it's because of like, you know, the lack of choice, um, but it feeds into much more than that. It feeds into much more than that, and it feeds into this kind of separation that, right, that over the next past while, in the next while, there are going to be a number of challenges, I would say, that are going to happen in the country, and the ability to deal with those challenges is broken, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, despite that kind of rant at the end, I hope that's been interesting. I think ultimately, none of this worked. The intention with the whole election, general election, well, the presidential election did not work. RTE did not work in the way that it was supposed to. Media didn't work in the way it was supposed to, and they've ended up in this position whereby, let me just get one of my older tweets on this. I think one major outcome of this election is that more and more people are starting to realize we don't really live in a democracy. We live in an authoritarian, crippled, and tired gerontocracy that is bored with itself, masquerading as a progressive, enlightened, caring society. Yep. So, I mean, yeah, like, I think ultimately, like, those two parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, like, whatever to take out about this entire election, I've kind of just talked about how it kind of relates back into and drags into other issues. Yeah, welcome to the new Ireland, someone said there. I think ultimately what this drags back into is that, like, those two parties are, they're on the decline in a way, because they're isolating themselves and they're isolated from everyone. Now, how well does the Irish left do outside of that? I mean, I've argued obviously that, like, it's not as much of a thing, and like, when I see images like this, like, it's, Paul Cunningham, it's kickoff at independent presidential candidate Catherine Connolly's campaign launch. Like, I take a look at a picture of these people and I kind of think, you know, where's the vision for Ireland? Where's the vision for culture, arts, music? You know, where's the ideas for, you know, making Ireland an economic powerhouse, right? Um, what are your plans for various geopolitical changes and events? Um, corporation tax, energy. Energy is so important. I want to do a full stream on energy. And I kind of see these people, obviously, and I don't see any of this, right? Like this image, like this just looks tired and bored and low energy, you know? I mean, you go back to kind of the spoil the vote thing. I mean, the spoil the vote thing really was incredible in that way, because, like, you know, all done on Twitter and, you know, TikTok and things like that. No real support, no real funding, just people talking to each other. And despite that, it was able to kind of basically surpass RTE and all of these things. I mean, like, I think anyway, that's quite positive. I think that's very, very interesting. And again, I know that, like, the presidential election is kind of more of a once-off thing, but, like, for the two parties, for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, I think they're just low energy. I think they've been hollowed out, and I'm not saying they're going to go away, but, they are going to become less of a thing as time goes on. And this election has turned in from kind of almost just get Heather Humphreys in or Jim Gavin in, we'll take that, to being something that's, humiliated these two parties. And Martin could be gone as well, which is, yeah, interesting times. Heard there was all the supposed work of mastermind Declan Ganley a day or two before the election. I had planned to spot. Yeah, I mean, like, I was when I did that stream, the exactly, Chapman. When I did the stream, um, part one, like I was talking about spoiled the vote a month ago, and I was far from the first person to talk about it. Spoiled the vote was being talked about like for weeks and weeks and weeks, and like that, you know, no, yeah, no, I'm just backing up your point here, but yeah, it's just like the thing has been a farce, but it, and yes, I know things can kind of like seem a bit kind of worse or not going well right now, but like I think this worked out pretty well for us, or just for Irish people in general, in my opinion, among in a number of different ways. So yeah, I think that's it really. I think we're getting kind of close here to the end of the stream. So I'm just looking at my points here. Yeah, the collapse of the two parties, victory of the left being fake. Yeah, I think we're getting to the end of this fairly quickly. I'm just going to take a look at the comments there. Um, oh, it's plan to spoil all along. Yeah, yeah, yeah. When I did that stream, I was saying like vote for Connolly, but at the time, like the numbers were like, the polls were saying that Connolly was like in second place or third place, but by the time over the past couple of weeks, it was clear she was going to win by a mile. So I spoiled the vote as well. Um, but yeah, I mean, actually, that was the thing I wanted to mention there. Kind of just went out of my head that, like, with the spoiled the vote energy, you know, watching kind of like like what you can see on your screen there, you know, their response to all of this, and then when people are writing stuff like what happens in City West and all that on their ballots, there's an energy to that, and that energy is not going away really. So yeah. So yeah, ultimately speaking, like just to kind of conclude this and to sum this up, the major trends this has shown a lot of people like kind of like inward looking the system has become. 13-14% at the very least know that now. It's shown that RTE is weakened considerably. The two main parties have taken a hit from this. If City West didn't happen last week, I don't think spoil would have been as effective. That's completely true as well. I agree with that. Like there was some boxes being opened in Jobstown. I know, obviously a bit further out from City West, but like which whereby 50% of the votes were spoiled. I the like I was saying before, presidential elections tend to be extremely more unpredictable than kind of your average election. And I think the City West thing certainly did lend to the spoil your vote thing. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, like I said, it's you can see the signs of it. It's going to lead, and it has led to kind of a more authoritarian, inward-looking thing. It's weakened the two parties. More and more people are kind of aware now a bit of how the system works. They're going to try kind of containment with all of this. But yeah, this was not supposed to happen. This was like the outsider candidate, like relatively speaking, the outsider candidate winning, right? Um, and yeah, like I said before, there's a certain set of priors that they have, approaching this as kind of like reacting to things rather than being proactive. And yeah, they'll say what they want to say, but I can't really see anything, manifest from this. Well, from their end, right? It's just going to be like, Fianna Fáil kind of declining further, Fine Gael declining further. But, you know, it's a case of what comes next then. And I think there's a lot of good positivity, and I think there's a lot of good energy. And, the fact that like you could have something as successful in a low energy, boring campaign as spoiled the vote, and you can get a result like that is absolutely, it's remarkable, really. But again, they won't look into that, and they won't look into the kind of the bigger numbers and why, you know, a big chunk of like younger women all supported Catherine Connolly, and a chunk of younger men were disproportionately, in terms of just spoiling the vote. That tells you an awful lot as well. But yeah, I'm not gonna. I think we're getting kind of late enough on here, so yeah, I think we'll shut it down here. So basically, yeah, that's basically it, and that's my kind of feelings of it. So yeah, I know, I don't know, I think it worked out pretty well. 19 people here. Thank you very much. I think there was more. I think there was about 25, 26 at one stage, but that's all good. All right, cool. Yeah, we'll shut it down here. Thank you very much for everyone joining. Very kind of just kind of on a half ramble there. It's very kind of unusual for me to do. Like, I think I've done like 4 streams in the space of a month, which is very unusual. But yeah, it's kind of been fun talking about this, and yeah, interesting times, and have a good rest of your week. It's only a 4-day week for a lot of people or whatever. And yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you and good night.